All right, let's get right into it. Think about those massive, massive, billion-dollar projects you hear about. High-speed rail, gigantic power grids. These things are enormous bets on our future. But what happens when one of these huge bets goes sideways? That's what we're digging into today. Who really pays when a mega project fails? It's the first question on everyone's mind when one of these things hits a wall, right? You see the headlines, project canceled, costs explode. And you immediately think, okay, so who's on the hook for this mess? Is it the private investors who signed up for the risk? Or is it, us, the taxpayers, who end up footing the bill? Well, what if I told you the answer has almost nothing to do with whether the project gets saved or scrapped? It's a real twist.
Yeah, the answer always seems to pop up like this big surprise, right? It gets debated endlessly on the news. But according to the research we're breaking down today, it shouldn't be a surprise at all. In fact, the real answer was probably decided years, maybe even decades before anything ever went wrong. It was all locked away in the fine print.
So let's get into the first big idea here, which is all about taking a sledgehammer to a really common myth. We love to frame this as a simple story of a bailout versus letting them fail. But it turns out that's just not how it works.
So here's the way most of us think about it. It seems logical, right? If a project gets canceled, well, the private investors lose their money. If the government swoops in to save it, taxpayers have to pay up. Makes sense. But the reality is so much weirder than that. Looking at whether a project lives or dies tells you almost nothing about who actually eats the cost. You can have a canceled project stick taxpayers with the bill, and you can have a project that survives and still leaves the private investors totally wiped out.
Okay, so if the project's fate doesn't tell us who pays, then what does? Well, the answer lies in seeing that there are actually two totally separate levers of power being pulled here. Let's break down how this framework just completely changes the game.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. On one side, you have the question, who decides? This is all about what the paper calls authority concentration. Basically, how much power does one group, like a central government, have to just say yes or no, to kill or save the project? That's what decides the project's fate. But then, on the other side, you have a totally separate question. Who pays? And that's determined by something called loss mutualization capacity. It sounds complicated, but all it means is, did somebody write rules ahead of time, like government guarantees or specific laws, that created a pipe for the losses to flow to the public? That is what decides the loss allocation.
And this is the absolute key takeaway. These two things are not connected. They are totally separate. A government can have all the power in the world to kill a project with a single signature. But if the rules to spread those losses around don't already exist, there might be no way for them to pay off the private companies, even if they wanted to.
So you're probably thinking, okay, that's a cool theory, but how on earth do you prove it? And this is where the research gets really, really smart. To make sure they weren't just cherry-picking stories, the researchers came up with this brilliant method I'm calling the time travel test to see if this pattern was actually real.
So here's what they did. First, they went looking for any of those pre-existing payout rules. But, and this is the crucial part, they only looked at documents written before the project ever got into trouble. We're talking old laws, original contracts. Then, to figure out who actually paid the bill, they jumped forward in time and only looked at documents written after the crisis was in full swing, things like government budgets and bankruptcy filings. By keeping the evidence totally separate in time, they could see if the old rules could genuinely predict the future.
And that's why this is so powerful. As the paper puts it, this method ensures the association is discovered, not definitional. What that means is they're not just saying, well, there was a guarantee and it got used. No, they're proving that the existence of that guarantee, documented years ago, was an incredible predictor that public money would be spent years later. It's a real tangible pattern, not just a circular argument.
So what happened when they ran the test? They examined 19 huge infrastructure projects that all ran into deep trouble. And they found that 12 of them had some kind of pre-existing rule already on the books, a guarantee, a law, something that created a pathway to push the losses onto the public. And just look at this. It's incredible. For those 12 projects where a payout mechanism was already in place, in a whopping 10 of them, the public ended up footing the bill. In 0 cases did the losses stay fully private. The pre-existing rules were basically a crystal ball. You could argue the game was rigged from the very beginning.
Okay, so what about the other projects? There were 7 projects that also hit a crisis, but these had no pre-existing rules for socializing the losses. No guarantees, no special laws, nothing.
And the result here is just as jaw-dropping. In every single one of those 7 cases, the losses stayed with the private investors, 100% of the time.
I mean, you can't get a clearer result than that. It shows that the presence or absence of those old rules was basically the only thing that mattered.
Now, numbers that clean can feel a little abstract, so let's ground this in a real-world example that shows the framework in action perfectly. The UK's massive and controversial high-speed rail project, known as HS2.
So here's the quick and dirty timeline. Back in 2017, the UK government goes all in, passing an act of parliament to make it happen. Fast forward to 2020, and a huge review shows that costs are just spiraling out of control. Then in 2023, the government makes a bold move. They cancel the entire northern part of the line.
Now, let's plug this into our two-lever framework. First, authority concentration. Was it high? Oh, you bet. The UK government had the centralized power to kill the project, and that's exactly what it did. But now, what about loss mutualization capacity? It was completely absent. There was no law on the books that guaranteed the private contractors would get paid out if the project was axed. And the result? Exactly what the framework would predict. The project got canceled, and the losses stayed private. This case just shatters that old myth that a powerful government automatically means a public bailout.
Okay, so let's step back for a second. What's the big lesson here? Why is it so important to understand this framework, especially for the huge projects we're planning today?
Here's the bottom line, the thing you have to remember. All those frantic arguments we see when a project is failing, all the headlines and the political drama about who should pay, it's mostly just noise. The real, binding decisions about who is on the hook were made quietly, years before, buried in the text of laws and contracts.
And you might think, well, can't a government just change its mind and decide to create a bailout out of thin air? The paper has a term for that, retroactive socialization. It's a last-minute political move to pay for private losses when no rules said they had to. And what's wild is that in their entire study, they found 0 clear cases of this actually happening. It's the pre-existing rules of the game that matter, not some last-minute political decision.
And that brings us to a really important question for right now. If the destiny of who pays for failure is being written as we speak in the fine print for the next generation of mega projects, think about the global race to build AI data centers. What do those rules say? Have we already decided who pays the price if these huge new bets don't pan out? That's the question this research forces every single one of us to ask.